Hi, my name is Dan Brown, and I'm with the law firm McDermott, Will and Emery, LLP. I'm outside counsel to the Surplus Line Association of California. Before we get started, let's review our antitrust resolution. When involved in meetings or other activities of the association, members of the association should be mindful of the antitrust laws and not engage in discussions or conduct with the purpose or effect, directly or indirectly, of fixing or stabilizing premiums or producer compensation, engaging in bid rigging or false quotes for insurance, engaging in potential anti-competitive conduct or activities that could adversely affect the cost, quality, or availability of insurance products or services, or engaging in any other anti-competitive conduct or activities affecting their businesses or the business of insurance. Members are advised that violations of state or federal antitrust laws may result in civil and/or criminal penalties, and that any member acting contrary to the intent of this resolution shall be subject to disciplinary action under the association's constitution. With that, I thank you, and you have been admonished.
Our mission is to ensure that a responsive and lawful surplus line insurance market is maintained in California. Our measures of success in this respect are that the consumer is protected, the needs of the regulators are well served, and unlawful activities are curtailed. Through a professional and committed organization, utilizing state-of-the-art technology and a challenging work environment, we respond to the needs of the California consumer, our membership, and appropriate public agencies. We provide education, processing, evaluation, and dissemination of surplus line data and information to help ensure the financial integrity and stability of the surplus line market. Welcome to the virtual edition of the Surplus Line Association of California's 2021 annual meeting. Please welcome Terry Moran, Chair, Board of Directors.
Hello everyone, I'm here with Ben McKay, CEO and Executive Director of the SLA, and we would like to welcome you to the 2021 annual meeting of the Surplus Lines Association of California. We have a full agenda for the 90 or so minutes that we will be together today, but let's start by taking a moment to reflect on those in the industry we lost in 2020.
Rick Brown, former outside counsel to the Surplus Line Association of California. Rick Brown was a very good friend, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge and understanding of the insurance regulatory world. Jerry Sullivan, SLA Board Chair, 1979 and 1995. Donald Grant, founder of the Western Re-Managers Insurance Services, served as SLA Board Chair, 1988. Don was a gracious man, a courageous and determined leader, and a true industry icon. He will be truly missed. Ian Fitt, SLA Board Chair, 2014. Michael J. Hall, founder of MJ Hall and Golden Bear Insurance Company, served as SLA Board Chair, 1997. Michael was a great leader, broker, and mentor. I'll miss his storytelling, his incredible gift of delivering a joke, and the wonderful times fishing in Alaska with his son Rupert. When you think of E&S in the dictionary, a picture of Michael Hall should be front and center. Bob Gilbert, SLA Board Chair, 2018 and 2019.
As we reflect on those we lost, it's great to see all of you tuned in today, supporting and being active in this industry like Donald, Michael, and Rick were. It is important in helping this association achieve our mission of fostering a healthy, fair, and competitive marketplace. 2020 was, well, to say the least, interesting. We witnessed something that will change us forever. The Dodgers finally won the World Series. It reminds me of when my Giants won 3 World Series not too long ago. Do you remember that, Ben?
I do.
The only difference is the Dodgers get an extra trophy in the form of an asterisk.
Ooh.
Sorry, guys. So congratulations to all of our Dodger fans out there. I know there are many of you. Again, thank you all for logging in here today for our annual meeting. Ben and I are streaming to you out of the SLA's headquarters in San Ramon. And we come together in unusual circumstances and unfamiliar format. But our ability to hold this meeting virtually speaks to the SLA's preparedness and its constant ongoing evolution. The purpose of the annual meeting is to give our members and interested parties an update on the SLA's activities and operations over the past year, and a look at where the association is heading in the coming year. Over the next 90 minutes or so, we will take some time going over what happened in 2020. Certainly COVID-19 overshadowed much of what happened. We had a record number of storms and catastrophes, and then of course the election, which included the first woman VP, purple suit, and then an unprecedented number of lawsuits that followed regarding our election process. All the events of 2020 will impact us not only today, but tomorrow as well. We will discuss today how these events impacted the SLA and turn our eyes to the future. We are very fortunate to have Robert Hartwig with us today. Dr. Hartwig is the head of the Risk and Uncertainty Management Center at the University of South Carolina, and previously he led the Insurance Information Institute for many years. Additionally, Ben McKay, our CEO, will address the SLA's key goals for 2021. In my remarks, I will briefly discuss the shifts we made in terms of education, and I have asked Tim Shea, the chair of the Education Committee, to address both the results of 2020 and to discuss how we will build on this in 2021 and beyond. Finally, certainly last but by no means least, we will close with Hank Haldeman, chair of the Legislative Committee, and his view of what we might expect both in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento in the coming year. One of the recurring themes at the SLA is that preparing for foreseeable events helps this association to be prepared even when unforeseeable events occur. The SLA created a digital communications department to produce high-quality video and web production, and that's why it was ready to shift from in-person CE courses to live webinars when the COVID pandemic hit. The SLA built the capacity for all of its employees to work from home, anticipating that events such as a power shutoff due to the growing wildfire threat might require mass telecommuting. Again, that's why we were ready when COVID shut down workplaces in March. And we raised the stamping fee because an inversion of the yield curve signaled an oncoming recession. Well, the recession hit, but not for the reasons that the economists expected. Raising the stamping fee enabled the SLA to fully get its fiscal house in order. When I became chair, I wanted the SLA to pay off all its debts and begin building its contingency funds to a level appropriate for the nation's largest SLA. In 2020, the association made tremendous progress. It paid off the $1.7 million construction loan necessitated by the move from San Francisco to San Ramon in 2017, retiring that debt a full 2 years ahead of schedule. The SLA also made significant strides toward retiring its pension liability, thanks to the leadership and hard work of its new controller, Ivan Morse. The first phase, targeting 51 former employees who were still on the books, 46 accepted a lump sum buyout. Total participants still on the plan have dropped from 87 to 42, with most of the rest being targeted for buyouts in 2021. If there are any pensioners who do not accept the buyout, their accounts will be transferred to an outside company to administer, thereby taking the liability entirely off the SLA books. With these liabilities removed, the SLA will work on boosting its contingency funds, which are about to lose $3 million due to a change in accounting standards. Much of what the SLA has been doing in recent years has been this kind of work, shoring up the ship, getting the house in order. For example, the SLA eliminated its filing backlog in 2019, capturing all those outstanding stamping fees contributed to the fiscal health of the association in 2020. The SLA has also been working hard to get the right team fully in place. Over the last year or so, it created new positions or departments, bringing in David Kodama as Executive Vice President and James Green as VP of Digital Communications. Additionally, the SLA has brought in talented leaders to replace longtime senior staffers who retired. We welcomed Joanne Delgado to lead Education and Compliance and promoted Glenn Leung as the head of Financial Analysis. Barbara Tremblay, who had worked with the SLA as a consultant, became our head of HR. Vani Ganti was promoted to lead the Technology Department. And she, along with Barbara, Jody Black of Data Analysis, became part of the senior staff in 2020. Congratulations to all of them. We have also been well served by the fact that surplus lines as an industry can run counter-cyclical to economic times. During tough times, a lot of business flows from the admitted market into our sector. The combination of shoring up our ship and the continued growth of the surplus lines market, even in uncertain economic times, has put the SLA in a very strong position coming into 2021. And our ability to pivot in the face of unexpected circumstances has served us well also. But that is what our industry does. We work in uncertain spaces. The SLA reflects the flexibility of our market sector. One example of that flexibility, as I noted earlier, was how the Education and Compliance Committee and the department pivoted from an internship program, which we were unable to do in 2020, to more of a focus on live CE webinars. Although this move was born of necessity, the results indicate that attendance for the webinars is much more robust than we might expect for in-person courses. We are getting anywhere from 220 to 500 attendees for our online webinars. Our in-person courses typically range from 180 to 240 attendees total, roughly half attending in San Francisco and the other half in LA. In short, the low-end attendance for our webinars is roughly the same as our high-end for our in-person courses. These results point to how we can continue to provide a valuable service to our members. Think about it. Of course, making live CE courses available via the web adds value. Rather than having to take the better part of a day to drive into San Francisco or Los Angeles and then out again, brokers taking CE courses via webinar can simply log in, log out, saving valuable time and helping them to be more productive. In addition to focusing on what we can do for our members, we are also honing in on how to keep our team thriving during these unusual times. Our COO, Joy Urban, has taken on the role of Chief Cultural Officer, leading the efforts to look after our employees' health and wellness. Clifton Brown, our head of public affairs, has been tasked with an internal communication strategy to ensure that we are reaching out and keeping the staff together even while they are forced to be apart. A recent survey of SLA staff found overwhelming support for the strategy. 100% of respondents indicated that the SLA's communications to employees has been just right. With that, I'm going to move forward wrapping up, but before I finish, I would like to provide some vital statistics for you for fiscal year 2020. Revenues came in at $24.5 million, more than $4 million ahead of the $20 million budget. In terms of net cash impact, I have already gone over how that excess was used to shore up the SLA's contingency funds. Operating expenses came in at $17.9 million, about $250,000 below budget. Capital costs were $1.9 million, slightly more than the $1.8 million budgeted. Before I hand it off to Ben McKay for his comments, we need to finalize the election of our board and officers for 2021. The nominating committee recommended no changes as all members have agreed to serve for another year if elected.
The 2021 slate for Board of Directors is SLA Chair Terry Moran with Paul Hansen Partners, SLA Vice Chair Janet Beaver with Tokyo Marine HCC Casualty Group, SLA Secretary-Treasurer Rich Gobler with Burns & Wilcox, SLA Past Chair Robert Gilbert with Markel West Insurance Services, and members Timothy Shea with R.E. Shea & Associates, James Faley with Vela Insurance Services, LLC, Hank Haldeman with Worldwide Facilities, LLC, Jason Howard with CRC Group, Pam Quillisi with Krause & Associates Insurance Services of Northern California, Inc., Charlie Rawson with Ryan Specialty Group, Kathy Schroeder with Sierra Specialty Insurance Services, Inc., Terrence Villar with Amwins Insurance Brokerage of California, John Washington with Arch Insurance Group, and the 2021 nominee for mediator is the Honorable Harry Lowe.
We have already circulated a ballot electronically, and we expect that most authorized voting representatives who intend to vote have already done so. At this time, we'll open the floor for any additional nominations. Please note that if there are any nominations, we will need the nominee's name, a statement of qualifications from the member making the nomination, and the nominee will have to accept the nomination. At that point, the nominee must be fully vetted by the CDI, and that nomination would then be subject to a contingent election. James, can you please open the microphones? There being no additional nominations and having received sufficient votes to elect the board and officers, the 2021 Board of Directors and officers are elected. I can also announce at this time that voters have approved another term for Harry Lowe to serve as the SLA mediator. I would also like to announce at this time that registrants have approved the minutes of the 2020 annual meeting. Thank you all for attending to this vital business. I am now pleased to introduce the SLA's CEO and Executive Director, Ben McKay, with congratulations for a phenomenal year, both financially and managing through 2020.
Thank you, Terry. And thank you for your steadfast leadership through this very tumultuous time. Obviously, the credit for the SLA's success goes to you, the board, and to our great team at the SLA. We've got 107 amazing employees who really pulled together during this pandemic to keep the ship right.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Terry talked to you a lot about the accomplishments of the SLA, and I sort of want to give you a feel for what the culture was like during this pandemic and what the attitude is going forward. And certainly, shelter in place, working fully remote is not something that we necessarily anticipated, certainly not for a long period of time. But working from home for short periods of time actually was, because you'll recall we had the PG&E power shutdowns. And so in anticipation of those outages, the SLA was obviously prepared to work from home for short periods of time. And we estimated that our efficiency during those times was about 70%. So you can be pretty efficient, but there's just some things we couldn't do. And frankly, there were some tools we just didn't have. And during that time, during 2020, what we call year zero. So 2020 was the year that we were going to sort of take a new step in the evolution of the SLA. Prior to 2020, we had been shoring up the ship, to continue that analogy. We've been chasing a lot of rabbits, putting together broker accounts and online filings, getting the backlog eliminated. Those type of activities are critically important, sort of the core block and tackle of the association. That all having been accomplished, 2020 was supposed to be the year where we sort of set the planning in place to take the next big evolutionary step. And so the senior staff, all these new members, really needed to figure out how we're going to work together without the benefit of years of working together. So we needed to accelerate that process. So one of the things we did was we started training together an hour and a half a week with a coach, plus homework, and try and learn the same management language, the same management tools, so that we would quickly become a cohesive unit. Of course, we fully expected that to be done in person, and very quickly that became a virtual training, which ended up being a blessing in disguise, because none of us had experience with a lot of these online tools like Asana and Miro, tools that we needed to survive a pandemic. And early on in that training, we all read as part of the course the classic management book, Good to Great. And in that book, there is one story that really stood out and sort of shaped how we thought about the pandemic. And that was the story about the Stockdale Paradox. For those of you who don't know or don't remember, Admiral Stockdale was a resident of the Hanoi Hilton. He was a prisoner of war in the prisoner of war camp known as the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. He was the highest ranking prisoner in that camp. And he is widely credited with having saved many lives and many minds through his actions as a prisoner of war. And that included things like creating systems to keep other prisoners' minds off of the torment that they were going through, including their own sort of Morse code that they developed with brooms, long sweep, short sweep, so that they can communicate by sweeping the floor and communicate with those prisoners who were what they call in the hole, so they could hear that they weren't alone. So those small things and large things really are what make Admiral Stockdale a pretty incredible person. Years afterward, after he was released after the war, he was asked, given the intensity of that situation, life or death situation, who didn't make it? Like, what was the mindset of the prisoners who didn't survive? And he said, ironically, paradoxically, the prisoners who didn't make it were the optimists. You would think the optimists would have had the better time and would have made it, but as it turns out, the optimists were the ones who thought, look, by Christmas, there's going to be a prisoner swap and we're going to be out of here. And then Christmas would come and it would go and they were still in the prison. And that would crush a lot of them. And then the ones that didn't crush, the optimists that didn't crush would say, well, next Christmas, there'll be a prisoner swap and we'll be out of here. And the next Christmas came and went and they were still in the prison and those were crushed. So then he was asked, well, then what was the mentality of the people who survived? And he said it was the prisoners who were willing to face the harsh, cold realities of their situation. The ones who knew we're going to be here for the long haul. How do we set our minds? What activities do we undertake to make it bearable, to survive over the long haul? And those are the prisoners who made it out with their minds intact and their lives intact. And that's the approach we took. Granted, it's a very different situation. We're not in a prisoner of war camp, but we can learn from that. And we said, we originally had the same mentality as a lot of people. Oh, it's a shelter in place for 2 weeks. Shelter in place, maybe another 2 weeks. But very quickly we said, hey, remember Stockdale? Let's not play that game that we're going to be home for Christmas. Let's face the hard, cold reality that we're going to be here in this environment, in this posture for a long time. And once we made that decision as a senior team, it changed the way we looked at virtually everything. It changed the way, for instance, we looked at that chair we've been sitting at, that hard wooden chair that we took from the kitchen table and we used as our desk chair. That's okay for a week, probably not okay for a year. All of a sudden everybody comes into work a little bit crooked. How you're going to treat your employees, what programs are you going to put in place? Do you create a health and wellness committee of your employees if you're only going to be at home for a week? Probably not. For a year, you probably do. And we did. So by adopting that Stockdale perspective, it changed fundamentally how we approached the pandemic for the better. And I think all the successes that Terry talked about really spring from that decision, spring from the decision to train together as a team and then to come to that conclusion that we should adopt that paradox as a team. So let's talk about 2020 and the impact of COVID, because it was considerable. And you're gonna see an amazing presentation from Bob Hartwig. He's our keynote speaker, and he's gonna talk about the impact nationally and by various lines of business. I want to just hit on the California experience and specifically some of the SLA's experience. For starters, because we had adapted early on, the backlog remained eliminated. So business as usual, business successful, both in terms of quantity and quality. We were able to continue processing, continue to analyze carriers. All of our core functionality continued. And in fact, in some areas we expanded. Terry talked about the pivot to online CE classes. Our ethics class had 500 attendees, right? It's spectacular. It's the biggest event we've ever had. We had our first live streaming event, all during the pandemic. So the SLA moved forward during the pandemic, not backwards. Internally, record number of communications to our staff and record number of communications to all of you. That's intentional. We felt like during a pandemic, more communication was necessary than in normal times. And so we intentionally amped that up. The market in California didn't miss a beat. Premiums grew 22.7% in 2020. Spectacular year by any standards and better than the other states. Item count likewise grew 8%. So not as robustly as premium, obviously signaling another couple of data points that point to a hardening market, right? Premium grew almost 23%, item count grew only 8%, about a third. Obviously there's winners and losers. And you might ask, during a pandemic when so much activity was shut down, how did surplus lines prosper? Well, for starters, the early on lines of coverage that were hit, we don't write. Personal auto, workers' comp, that's not surplus lines. So we have to look at the lines really that we do write. And we're going to show you a bar chart here that shows you the top ones that grew and the bottom ones that shrunk. Not surprisingly, among the top four, communication and networks. So think about Zoom. Wouldn't we all love to have a few million shares of Zoom stock, a couple years ago, right? Communication networking has exploded. Public and municipalities, these are your cities. We think that's driven largely by lawsuits against law enforcement and civil unrest. Consider the activities this summer. Utilities, we think that's driven by wildfires. That won't surprise anybody in California. And another one that won't surprise anybody, food delivery. So if your household is like the McKay household, the number of food deliveries that have come to our house has gone up 10x. And now my kids have discovered how to do it, so it's about to go up another at least 5x. On the bottom side, again, not surprising, retail, rideshare, services and hospitality, entertainment, all the things we can't do anymore. So that's not surprising. But what you might find interesting is, of all four of those, obviously ride sharing is the biggest, but all of them put together don't equal the increase we saw in utilities. So that again shows why surplus lines was able to weather COVID so well. The things that are a small part of our market are the ones that got hit hardest. The things that are a big part of our market actually grew because of the pandemic, the wildfires, other things. Some general comments. We saw consolidation. Their top 10 brokers accounted for 66% of the premiums in 2020. And 10 policies out of 800,000, just to give you a sense of magnitude. So there's about 800,000 items. There's about 10 policies that accounted for about $1 billion in premium, so about 8% of the entire market. So obviously we watch those closely because they have a disproportionate impact on the marketplace. So that begs the question, well, what if there was no COVID? What would have happened in 2020? Would it have been a better year, a worse year? Did we benefit? Were we penalized because of COVID? Our internal stats genius, Wharton School analytics guy, Mike Cataregli, created a regression analysis to sort of answer this question. And our best, or his best guess is, or not guess, because we had a very good fit on the model, is that we probably lost out on about 6.3% of growth. And if you were to take those bottom categories, the retail and entertainment, and you put all those together and put them on top of the 22.7%, it makes sense, right? Just sort of, it makes sense that we could have gotten another 6.3 out of those lines of coverage. This, of course, is the regression analysis. So in a summation, market's hardening, consolidating, and growing. Biggest drivers of premium, up and down, wildfire, COVID, reviver bills, civil unrest, social inflation. We can go on and on. Some of the others I should mention, interest rates, tightening reinsurance markets, and emerging cyber risk, which of course we hear about whenever we're not hearing about the pandemic or the election. And at the end of the day, that's really where our market is. So, planning for the future, or how did we, what do we do now? So knowing that, what in year zero, what else were we going to do? Chase the rabbits. Now we got to figure out, who are we? What is the marketplace? It's been a long time since we really try to evaluate our own membership and our own space, our own market. Who does it consist of? What does it consist of? And so what we decided to do really at the end of 19 leading into 2020 was to interview our members. And so we interviewed 102 different companies all over the United States, all surplus lines brokers, and tried to figure out who they were, what differentiated them from each other, and how they used our services, and therefore try and conclude how we could improve our services. And I want to share with you 4 takeaways. There were many more than 4, but let me share 4. Number 1, you can see widely dispersed. Our membership is all over the United States. In fact, even our licensees, if you take out the stakeholders, meaning the compliance people and the lawyers and the executives, we're 50-50. Half of the people with California surplus lines licenses are residents in California. The other half are resident outside of California. And then if you look at where compliance is done, and you can see from this map, compliance is largely done, particularly for the large centralized shops outside of California. And so that just gives us some data that we need to use when we're developing our internal processes, and I'll talk about that in my next section. The other takeaway we found was that our membership breaks down pretty neatly into 3 segments, largely and 3 segments by size. And these are them with some examples of who might be in each segment. And the reason that these segments are important is because the way the segments use our services and the way the segments view the SLA differ. And then in our internal analysis, we also horizontally bifurcate this by geography and then by role within the organization. So for instance, we'll look at filers and we'll look at executives and we'll look at compliance officers. And we have this data cut more than just 3 ways. This is just an oversimplified way to show you how we're thinking about the membership. And here's an example of that is we asked these segments, how are we doing? How's the SLA doing? We're not afraid of a little feedback. And overall, 7.7. So almost a C+, right? So pretty good, not great. Frankly, this is year 0. That's our benchmark, 7.7. Next time we do this, we want it to be better. But what we found is our rating in segment 1 was the lowest. And our rate went up as you crossed into different segments, and our rating changed depending on who you asked, what the role of the person you asked was. So that tells us that our ability to communicate with the different segments varies. And that's important because the only way we're going to be able to educate and help our members move towards 100% compliance is if we can communicate with them effectively. So this was an important finding. The last finding, which is interesting because it actually crosses segments, is that regardless of segment, all of you pretty much have a policy compliance processing process that is the same. So everybody basically files their policies the same way. And that's useful because we want to marry up, obviously, what we're doing with your processes. We want to make it easier. We want to make it intuitive. We want the filings to be right when they're made, not after they've been corrected, right? So the fact that everybody's basically doing it the same, there's a flow that everyone follows, is great news for us. And it's something that this analysis provided us, which is guiding the next section, which is, what are we doing? What are our big goals for 2021 and beyond? Well, I mentioned earlier, we've been chasing rabbits for a few years and getting those all in place. Now we're going after the big game. We call them the caribou. We're going after our 3 caribou. And our first caribou is 100% compliance. And I know that seems ambitious. We call it our Norman Peale power of positive thinking goal, right? And he's the gentleman, and I'll paraphrase here, who said, shoot for the moon, and even if you come up short, you'll hit the stars. Now, Mr. Peale's reversing of the celestial order aside, because we all know the moon's closer than the stars, it's a good point, right? Aim high, and if you fall short, you're still going to have success. And so what are we doing about helping with compliance? I'll give you an example. And there's a lot of objectives. So these are the big goals. The caribou are the big goals. Then we're going to have objectives under. One of them, for instance, is this. We had to have a shift in our mentality. For years and years and years, when you would make a filing, we would check it. If it was wrong, we'd tag it. And then we'd send it back to you. Tagged wrong, right? So, and our role or our mentality is we're going to find every mistake and tag you for it. We want to change that mentality to we're going to help you so you don't make the mistake in the first place, right? So we think that will get us to 100% compliance. Just finding mistakes isn't compliance. That's finding lack of compliance. What we want is compliance from the get-go. And so that's a mentality shift that we're making, and the teams we're creating, and I'll talk about that in a minute, are going to help us meet that goal. Okay, and by the way, when we talk about compliance, we don't just mean filing. We're going to create videos. We're going to create discussion groups. We're going to help with compliance. We're going to create influencer teams. We're going to create compliance at every aspect of your organization. We want Surplus Lines to be the role model in all of insurance, if not all of financial services. And it's going to start with us. And we're willing to take on that responsibility. Our second big caribou, our second big goal is member value program. Well, what does that mean? What's a goal there? What's an objective rather there? Well, one was driven by some information that came back from our interviews, which was, hey, every time I call the SLA, I get a different analyst. And sometimes I get a different answer to the same question. Why is that? And that's because different people hear things differently, and maybe you've asked the question slightly different, or maybe 2 analysts have a different understanding. But for whatever reason, it's probably driving you crazy. And we want to fix that. And how are we going to do that? We have teams already built into the SLA. Each team has a team leader, has a senior analyst, and then a group of analysts. And they review your policies. What we're going to do is assign all of broker A to team 1, all of broker B to team 2. So every time you call, you've got the same team, and that team has one person who ultimately is responsible, the team leader, for your filings. And in that way, we hope that you're going to get the same at least team every time you call, and you're going to build a relationship that we hope will lead to better compliance. Right? It'll humanize the process. And we do actually get amazing feedback, positive feedback on our analysts. So we're not looking to, change that. I mean, the emails I get back, kind and professional, 2 adjectives used in the same sentence to describe an analyst. If you're kind and professional, home run, right? I mean, that's what we want. That's what we want to portray. Next level is, timely, same question, same answer to the same question, and there for you. And part of that is the for you, as you saw from my map of the United States that showed we have brokers, Florida, New York, Chicago, Texas, all the way. Well, if we open our office at 9, right? What time is that in New York? Noon? Right? So if you're in New York, you can't get your question answered till noon. Doesn't seem right, right? That's an insight that frankly, we should have had a long time ago. So we're going to say, if you're a New York broker, you're going to get a team. The team that assigns you is going to be the early team. So when you show up at work, they're at work. If you have questions, you can ask them. And then it's the follow the sun model, right? And then the employees come a little bit later. They're your Texas and Chicago. And then, the late birds are your California team. So we're going to create this follow the sun model that we think is more responsive to the needs of the membership and frankly should lead to better compliance, which at the end of the day is what we're all after. The other thing we're looking to do to add some member value, not the only other thing, one of the other things is creating Augmenting the Learning Center. Some of you have already used it. This, of course, was the brainchild of our former chair, Bob Gilbert. Yep. And we think it's it was tremendously prescient because when we started developing it, there was no pandemic. Right. So now during the pandemic, wow, how great that we have this sort of one-stop shop for education. But we're going to augment that. That's going to have increasing levels of content, increasing levels of usability. So look for that as well in 21 and beyond. Again, most of our goals now, these big caribous, are multi-year goals. We'll have a single year and multi-year objectives under them, but the caribou themselves are multi-year. The third big caribou is employee health and wellness. Terry made it clear at the beginning of this pandemic and in her comments, but I want to put a nod to you, Terry. Very clearly, before anybody really thought about it, he said, don't forget your employees, right? They're the ones who take care of the members. They're the ones who make sure everyone's compliant, but you got to take care of them as well. And that really, me personally, and I know for the rest of the senior staff, laser focused our attention on them. We said, okay, yeah, if we're going to make that a priority, we got to make it a priority. We can't just give it lip service. So how do we do that? Well, one, make it one of your 3 big objectives. Nothing tells your employees you care more than saying, you're a third of our overall objectives for the next 3 years. The other thing we did, and you mentioned this, was we created a position of Chief Cultural Officer that you and I and Bob and the others on the board leadership talked about, and put our money where our mouths are again by saying we're going to have a very senior person, in fact, the second most senior person in the organization, in charge of your welfare. And that has worked out tremendously. In fact, let me give you an example. So one of the things that Joy did in that capacity said, I probably could use some training. This is new. It's new to everybody. She found this amazing course that Cornell had put together, which, pretty decent school out there on the East Coast. And frankly, the training's been incredible as she's related it to me. And some of the techniques that they teach, some are pretty simple but pretty powerful. One of them was she had a meeting with several employees, and first thing she asked, 0 to 10, how you doing? 0 to 10, how you doing? Completely unoffensive, it doesn't insinuate anything. How you doing? I'm an 8. I'm a 7. I'm a 3. Oh, 3. Okay, we got to circle back, right? It's an easy, simple way for your employees to let you know maybe they're in distress. Maybe they need a follow-up, right? without saying, hey, I'm in distress, I need a follow-up. Very, very good technique, I thought, and very powerful. So we've been using that among many others, but I just offer that up as something, if you're not using it, you may want to. It worked well for us. We use check-ins with our employees, calling around both by managers and non-managers. Sometimes it's way more effective if somebody not in the chain of command calls you, just says, hey, I'm just checking on you. We created a health and wellness committee. I mentioned that earlier, empowered our employees on that committee to make decisions, real decisions. Gave everyone a camera so we could see each other, right? I mean, how powerful is seeing each other versus, being isolated and only hearing voice? That was powerful. So we spent a lot of time, a lot of effort. We're just at the beginning. We're hoping to get more creative. We hope that you'll share your ideas with us, frankly, on how to make this the model, frankly, for the country and for all the other SLAs. So that's our third caribou. In conclusion, let me just say, regardless of what happens, we're ready. Financially, we retired our bad debt. We're taking care of the pension, strong reserves. We've got a 3-year plan in place. We've got great partners like the CDI, like all of you. We've got a great board who supports us, gives us great input, directs us in the right direction, gives us a nudge when we're going in the wrong direction. So we're ready. I think we couldn't be more ready. I couldn't be more proud of the team that you have at the SLA. Amazing employees, doing amazing things, amazing work. So with that, let me just thank you all for your time, your attendance, your dedication to this industry, your dedication to the association, your support of me and the senior team. It's absolutely noticed. It's absolutely appreciated. Thank you.
The surplus lines marketplace in California protects over 200,000 businesses and organizations that produce in excess of $600 billion a year in gross revenues. They employ over 3.5 million workers with annual payroll in excess of $150 billion and pay upwards of $45 billion in state and federal taxes. We are pleased to present our keynote speaker, Dr. Robert Hartwig, Clinical Associate Professor and Director of the Risk and Uncertainty Management Center at the University of South Carolina, as he presents the state of the property casualty insurance industry emerging from the COVID era.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Ben. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Bob Hartwig, and I am broadcasting to you from USC, the other USC, the University of South Carolina in beautiful Columbia, South Carolina. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to talk to you about the state of the property casualty insurance industry, of course, with some focus on the surplus lines markets. There's been a lot going on. That would be the understatement of the year over the past year or so. And in fact, there's going to be a lot going on for the next several years. And so without any further ado, let me give you a sense of where we're going to be headed in this presentation. We'll be talking about the industry's overall financial performance, and we'll talk about some growth trends in the surplus lines space as well. COVID-19, of course, is going to dominate much of my conversation today, and we're going to talk about a year ago what we thought would be the impacts of COVID on the industry and what they actually turned out to be, to the extent that we know that right now. Another dominant issue today, and in fact, throughout 2020, has been volatility in the investment market. So whether we're talking about the crash back in March or whether we're talking about GameStop and silver today, there's always something going on here. And insurers, of course, are some of the biggest investors on the planet. Now, in terms of the economy, that is going to have a tremendous impact on how fast the industry recovers in terms of growth and loss exposures. So we'll give you a sense of that. And then, of course, from surplus lines perspective, CAT activity has been very important, kind of lost in the headlines of what's been happening with COVID. We'll focus a bit on commercial lines performance in terms of growth and underwriting results, and we'll also talk about litigation trends with some focus on COVID also. We'll summarize, and then we'll have some time for Q&A afterwards. So without any further ado, let's get right into the financial results for the industry. Where are we? Well, let's start at the top in some sense. The industry is really measured by its ability to pay claims, and that is measured as a function of the industry's policyholder surplus. This is our claims-paying capital, and we did take a hit during COVID. In fact, the industry's overall capacity fell by about 9% during the first quarter of this year. But as you can see, it's actually made its way back up over the next several quarters. And in fact, although we do not have the fourth quarter data yet, it's all but certain we ended 2020 with record policyholder surplus. So it's not unusual for during times of strain for us to see a drop in the overall surplus, such as during the financial crisis when it was down about 16%, but only about 9% during COVID. So that's great news. The industry entered the year strong, stable, sound, and secure. It exited the year strong, stable, sound, and secure. In terms of profitability for the industry, we do expect that to take a bit of a hit. And while, again, these numbers are only estimated through actual third quarter data, we are expecting a drop in terms of net income after taxes, but not precipitously so. In terms of the industry's ROE, where are we? We would expect to see a drop in the industry's return on equity. And we're expecting to see somewhere around 4 and 4.5% when all is said and done for 2020. That's down about 3.5 points from the prior year. When COVID began, I actually went back to all the economic downturns back to 1970. And based on that, I estimated we would probably be down somewhere in the neighborhood of about 4.5%. 4.5 percentage points. And in fact, that's going to turn out to be just about exactly the case, or not too far from it. The experience of 2020 so far is maybe down close to 4 points. So that is pretty much close to expectations. The overall P&C insurance industry, as you can see in blue, tends to be less profitable than the Fortune 500 group, and that's been true for many, many years. That's in part because of the fact that we have many mutuals in the industry who are quite successful, but do tend to run lower ROEs than publicly traded companies, which dominate the Fortune 500. So we'll be quite a bit below the Fortune 500 in 2020 when all the data do come in. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about profitability and politics. We've just gone through an election, of course, like no other. And you might be interested to hear, however, that as contentious as the most recent election was, and in fact many elections are, over long periods of time, I have data going back 70 years, as it turns out, it makes no difference in terms of the party of who's living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Over the past 70 years, the ROE with Democrats occupying the White House was about 8%, and it was just below that for Republicans. It's not a statistically discernible difference, so the party of the president really has marginal bearing on profitability of the P&C insurance industry, and one of the reasons for that is something we'll talk about in detail later on. It has a lot to do with catastrophe activities. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, derechos, wildfires really don't care who's occupying the White House or what their party is. And that tends to create some of the largest fluctuations in ROE. You could see over many periods of time, over multiple presidential administrations, you could see the fluctuations in ROE. Many people will be surprised that the industry was never more profitable than it was under Jimmy Carter. And what was the reason for that? It was because interest rates were sky high, which were misery for many people, particularly someone, say, trying to get a mortgage. But if you're a large institutional investor who invests predominantly in bonds, when you could get 16% on a U.S. Treasury security with no risk, those were good times. Now, in terms of growth, let's focus on growth a little bit here. Where are we headed? This is the overall net written premium growth over the past 50 years. So we've got a half century of growth right here showing the average annual change. And what we're seeing are the hard markets in the 70s and the 80s. Some of those were tort-driven, inflation-driven. We see the market just before and after 9/11 in the early 2000s plunging to 3 years of negative growth in the wake of or during the financial crisis. That hadn't happened since the Great Depression. And so finally we wind up with growth somewhere just below 4%, close to 3% for 2020. And there'll be some interesting observations here. Why is it that growth is actually not that far off? In fact, if I look at AM Best's projections for 2020 growth across all lines, personal and commercial lines, that's what you're seeing in blue here. And what it shows is, so this projection was actually made just before COVID. And so it does not anticipate any impacts from COVID at all. So you see estimated growth to 3.8% across all lines. My estimate is we'll wind up at about 3.1% in 2020. I think better than most people presumed. And you could see both personal and commercial are down a bit, but not as down as much as one would have anticipated. In terms of underwriting performance, what do we see here? Well, surprise, surprise, we see almost no change in the combined ratio for 2020 relative to 2019. And also, this is very much in line with expectations of AM Best's pre-COVID estimate of around 98. So we're around 98 to 99 or so. And why is it? How is it? Well, we'll talk about why it is the fact that the industry combined ratio is not that far off the pre-COVID predictions. But I will say, and I think as many of you know, especially in California, cats were a big issue. And in fact, if I were to back out normalize for catastrophe losses, the combined ratio last year would be about 91. If I remove all the cat activity. If we normalize for a normal level of cat activity, the combined ratio this year would be last year would have been about 95, 94, somewhere in that vicinity. And so actually last year, 2020, despite COVID, would have been a better year, materially better year if it were for a normal level of catastrophe activity rather than anything having to do with COVID. So I think that's an interesting fact. And so let's see how far the actual results for 2020 were from early predictions associated with COVID, because there were a lot of predictions about what was going to happen to the industry. If you look on the premium side, there were estimates that as much as 12.5% to 25% reduction in premium written in economically sensitive lines like workers' comp. That would equate to $6 to $12 billion. You can see a number of other lines there seeing sharp reductions in premium volume. Business interruption, for instance, as businesses were forced to close across the economy, and many still are. We've had personal auto with a lot of givebacks in premium. Economically sensitive lines such as marine, aviation, transport. Again, a lot of predictions of devastating impacts there. And in terms of the losses associated with those lines, some wide range in predictions. For instance, workers' comp, predictions ranging from anywhere from a couple $100 million to more than $90 billion in losses, depending on the severity of the pandemic and how the presumption requirements in workers' comp were interpreted. Similarly, along the lines, we could actually see some, of course, very large losses in business interruption, contingency, those kinds of things in the U.S., but less in the way of loss when we're looking at both commercial and personal auto, but increases in losses in areas like D&O. So it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of the loss impacts. But if you went back to the first part of last year, April, May 2020, and you went and you accumulated and took a look at, surveyed all the results from various investment banks and so forth about what the potential losses were going to be to the P&C insurance industry, at least on a global scale, they ranged anywhere from a few billion to in excess of $100 billion, with entities like Lloyd's estimating about $107 billion, basically being one of the largest losses ever. Now, the data are still premature. It's still early. We have data only through the third quarter of 2020. But as it turns out, the numbers were nowhere near as bad as the expectation. And why is that? It's in part because we have an economic recovery that was proceeding more quickly than anticipated. Last year, in 2020, the economy was down about 4%. The expectation had originally been that the U.S. economy would contract by about 7%. That has a huge impact on insurable exposures. Rapid financial market recovery, and then some. So after a collapse by a third in the equities markets, we were actually up to record highs by the end of the year. Massive government stimulus, which is ongoing. Accommodative Fed policy, keeping interest rates low. The worst case epidemiological outcomes for the virus itself did not occur. Record pace of vaccine development, which caused an optimistic outlook for how things, we could always see the light at the end of the tunnel, essentially, from very early days. Employers did a reasonably good job of protecting workers from exposures. Many states did not repeat their spring lockdowns, although California is not one of those. Again, reemerging from lockdowns again. Litigation outcomes generally to this point have favored insurers. And again, the workers' comp presumption expansion did not lead to an explosion in claims as might have been anticipated. And so there were also offsetting exposures in many lines. So all of these and more, very, very important. But there's no question that the economic consequences of COVID, they're massive and they're ongoing. If you look at the estimated economic costs of pandemics, you get a good sense of their uninsurability, generally speaking. Although we'll talk a little bit about the fact that there are some opportunities, of course, particularly, I think, in the specialty space. But the estimate is that we're talking about estimated economic losses somewhere in the neighborhood of $9 trillion globally associated with COVID. And you see very often with respect to other pandemics, which are smaller in scale, but still tens of billions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars of potential economic losses. So only a tiny fraction of losses associated with pandemics can reasonably be expected to be underwritten in the private insurance and reinsurance sectors. If you just take a look in the United States and you look at business interruption losses for businesses with fewer than 100 employees, what you see is that these range anywhere from $52 billion to $431 billion per month. That's per month, against the total capital base of the entire P&C insurance industry in the U.S. of about $800 to $850 billion. So clearly, the insurability issue with respect to business interruption risks, business continuity risks, in other words, business income risks, all the same things, it's really questionable. And so I've written a couple of papers on this, and you could download this one that I co-authored with the APCIA, for instance, and it's publicly available. But at the end of the day, what it says is these large-scale pandemic risks, such as business continuity risks measured across the entire economy, are not privately insurable, generally speaking, and that there is an appropriate role for government here. This does not mean that there are not opportunities for private insurers and reinsurers, and especially in the pandemic space, in the specialty space associated with pandemics. Why is that? I believe there's going to be a huge opportunity for insurers, particularly specialty insurers and reinsurers, to develop all sorts of products which are going to be in incredible demand associated with, for instance, the event management, event cancellation, travel and tourism, and many, many other types of issues that are going to need insuring. Supply chain related issues, both directly related to vaccine distribution and many other things. So actually, in the next several years, in some ways, I think we'll see an enormous amount of innovation in the P&C insurance industry to address these risks, although again, the largest risks, like the business continuity risks themselves, will largely remain outside the purview of private insurability. But there's a lot of talk about whether 2020 and COVID were a black swan event. The reality of it is that events such as these pandemics have occurred throughout in the entirety of human history. What was the black swan event was the decision, and continues to be the decision of thousands of government administrators at all levels of government making different and uncoordinated decisions as to when, where, why, and how long businesses should be shut down. So, for instance, California is just opening up again for outdoor dining, but apparently you cannot watch TV outdoors, and you can only sit there for 90 minutes. Here in the southeast part of the U.S., it's completely opposite, and things have been open most of the time. So very, very different approaches to this, and you will see this in terms of the exposure figures that ultimately the insurers experience on a state-by-state basis. So across the country, I expect when all the numbers are in, we will see some states show relatively robust growth and other states show very, very flat growth. And a lot of that has to do with the approach to COVID. Now, in terms of impacts on premiums and claims, let's take a look at this. These are the major P&C lines, both personal and commercial. And what you see here is that, perhaps no surprise, the blue bar is showing the change in direct premiums written for 2020 over 2019 for the first 3 quarters. That's all the data we have at this point. The line most impacted is workers' compensation, where direct premiums written are down about 8.5%. That is well below the optimistic scenario that I showed you earlier on, where the prediction was 12.5% decline in premiums written, and the expectation was it could be as much as 25%. So comp is coming in better than that. We're also seeing inland marine, very economically sensitive, transportation, infrastructure, that showed some declines, and private passenger auto, where in fact companies had to give back a lot of premium with regulatory pressure in many states. So, but beyond that, if we move over to the right-hand side and we look at fire, allied, other liability, we actually see not much of a difference, in fact, some gains. In commercial auto, very strong gains indeed. So what are we seeing here? We are seeing, won't really dwell on this, but it does impact commercial auto in addition to personal auto because the results mirror one another. I wanted to show you this because what this shows is that during the second and third quarters of 2020, we saw, for instance, the number of collision claims reported to insurers fall by, in the second quarter, more than 35% and by more than 20% in the subsequent quarter. So very substantial drops, but of course driving activity is picking back up in much of the country. So that's a one-time event, and I expect driving activity in 2021 to, by mid-year, certainly by the third quarter, to have nearly fully recovered, both in the personal and the commercial lines context. On the E&S side, I was very fortunate to have the Surplus Lines Association of California provide me with some California data, but just to take a look at the U.S. overall first. I don't have 2020 data yet, but here you can get a good sense of where surplus lines premiums stand over the last several years, rising in the most recent year from about $50 billion to $55.5 billion. But California accounts for nearly 20% of all surplus lines premiums in the entire United States. And so here you can see the numbers for California over the past 15 years, including 2020. And you see a really substantial, about a 23% increase in overall surplus lines premium volume in the year. And that's on top of a pretty substantial growth in 2019 over 2018. So while I don't have the data state by state, I would hazard to guess that California is absolutely the market leader here in terms, or very close to it, at least in terms of the percentage growth. But you could see steady growth coming out of the impact from the last economic downturn, where we saw premiums plunge overall by about 30% over a several-year period. Night and day, absolutely no comparison to what happened to 2020 compared to what happened during the financial crisis, at least on the surplus line side. And when we look at the number of transactions and the average value of the transactions, the number of transactions has gone up pretty steadily as well, a little dip in 2019, but it's come back up to a record high. The average value of transaction has stayed relatively stable until recently, in which case it's actually gone up pretty substantially in the last couple of years. So again, kudos to Surplus Lines Association of California for providing that data and being able to allow me to compare this to what's going on in terms of surplus lines in the U.S. overall. Now, so I'm quite optimistic about E&S going forward. Why? There's going to be a lot of demand, and COVID is just the beginning of it. Ongoing high cat activity, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. Reduced capacity in some product segments and geography, so a lot of carriers pulling back in terms of limits or providing any coverage at all in some cases. A recovering economy is going to help build back some of the exposures that were lost, and this is going to help float everyone's boat. Post-COVID world, as I just mentioned, is going to be filled with opportunity for niche pandemic plays, and I think that is going to be centered on specialty insurers and on their reinsurers as well. Retrenchment by major insurers and reinsurers from carbon-based energy sector. I think this creates some opportunity in terms of specialty insurers as well. Adverse, uncertain tort outcomes. This always creates some opportunity, of course. We also are going to have some, this is going to be ongoing for decades, uncertainty with respect to where cyber risk is headed. We just heard about one of the largest hacks ever, SolarWinds, at the end of 2020, and we know that 2021 will be riddled with large-scale attacks among major retailers, banks, governments, you name it. And asset market volatility is going to continue to contribute to issues with respect to in the D&O space, for instance. But we've also got not just the volatility, we've got a lot of M&A activity. We've got SPACs, which you've probably heard about. We've got IPO risks, and we've got these unusual factors with short squeezes going on and so forth. Even companies like Robinhood were sued literally within 24 hours after the fact that they shut down some of their trading after the GameStop situation very recently. So we can expect more of that in 2021 and beyond. But I mentioned we'd be talking about cat losses here. And so this is going to be a huge driver, and it has been a huge driver for surplus lines insurers in terms of demand for product and demand for capacity. Last year, $67 billion in insured nat cats. That's the third largest, costliest year behind just 2017 and 2005, and a lot of that was in California with the wildfires. 71 designated property claims service events last year. That's a record across PCS's 72-year history. 10 declared tropical events. And with $26 billion in losses in the U.S., 17 declared wildfire events. Most of those in California. This is a new record, and this blew away the previous record of 6 declared events in 2017. About $11 billion in insured losses, around 5 million catastrophe claims actually associated with all of these events. 18 PCS events with more than $1 billion in insured losses is also a new record. And then also some unusual events, man-made events, such as the insured riots and others, such as the Nashville bombing on Christmas Day. So where are we? If this is a chart that shows the inflation-adjusted cat losses both annually and on a decade-by-decade average. So what you could see is, for instance, in the 1980s, the average annual insured cat loss in current dollars, or at least in 2018 dollars, was about $5 billion. In the 90s, it was 15. In the 2000s, it was 25. In the decade that just recently ended, it was $35 billion. So you can see where this trajectory is headed, especially given 2020 was a terrible beginning to the new decade. We were at $67 billion in insured losses in just this 1 year. So it is quite possible this trend could continue to build with an average of, say, $40 or $45 billion on an average annual basis for the current decade, because we've already got one terrible year under our belt. So we'll see. It'll take 9 more years' experience to see where that winds up. But it was off to a tough beginning. And you can see that most of the largest insured catastrophes that we've experienced in the United States have occurred in relatively recent history after adjusting for inflation. Largest event last year actually being Hurricane Laura at somewhere around $10 billion. Now, again, those were insured losses, and this has definitely had an impact on reinsurance markets, with reinsurance pricing reversing a multi-year downward trend. And so you can see that here with the rate on line index moving up, and both in the United States for property cat risks as well as on a global scale. But not as much or not as rapidly or sharply as we saw after other events, such as, for instance, 9/11. And there are some reasons for that, and part of that is because of the fact that there's a lot of alternative capital out there nowadays, which I think is essential in order to maintain long-term stability in the property catastrophe insurance and reinsurance markets on a global scale. So despite COVID, we had record issuance of cat bonds last year and record risk capital outstanding associated with these cat bonds. So although there was a dip in the second quarter, again, the market came back pretty strong, and so there's record capacity out there in terms of alternative capacity. So traditional reinsurance and alternative capital continue to have an interplay with one another in terms of their substitutability and complementarity. On the investment side, last year, obviously very, very volatile, and this is taking its toll. It looks like we're going to see, I think, a material drop in investment income based on the first 3 quarters of data. Sometimes the fourth quarter is somewhat unpredictable, but we'll see. And one of the pressure points here is going to be lower interest rates. And lower interest rates, as you know, the Fed has aggressively been pushing down interest rates and said it will continue to do that and maintain low interest rates at least through 2023. So that is the new normal, and we are approaching near an all-time record low for the net investment yield on the P&C insurance industry's invested assets, about 60% of which are in fact bonds. So interest rate sensitive. The lowest reading ever was 2.8% in 1961. It is not inconceivable that we will plumb those depths, if not in 2021, potentially in 2022. 60-year lows. And you can see the drop off both in short-term and longer-term interest rates here on the right-hand side of the chart. That even began before COVID, the Fed pushing down interest rates and, in fact, pushing them down even more aggressively as the recession from COVID really put the economy in a nosedive. And speaking of that, what a tumultuous year. We began 2020, basically a year ago. Of course, we were hearing a lot about COVID around the world. We had our first cases, many of them on the West Coast, but we thought perhaps it's a problem mostly in China, perhaps in some parts of Europe. And in February of 2020, we were sitting here with a 3.5% unemployment rate, the lowest it had been in about 50 years. But abruptly, COVID happened, putting an end to what had been the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. So RIP on that, but ended in February officially after 128 months. So really more than 10 years, almost 13 years of economic expansion. It's going to take a couple of years to recover all the growth that we lost. We will do that in nominal terms in the first quarter of 2021. And in real terms, it'll probably be in other words, inflation-adjusted terms, somewhere in the middle of 2021 or the third quarter or so. So we experienced last year, you could see in the first quarter, a drop of 5% in the real gross domestic product. The economy shrank by 5%, then plunged by about 31% in the second quarter, then rebounding by a similar amount in the third quarter, and now it's bouncing around a bit. We finished last year at a poor growth rate, 3.5%, 4% or so. That is the worst that we had seen since the end of World War II. We're expecting a robust second half of 2021, however. That's under the expectation that the vaccine program goes well, that businesses begin to invest, people begin to travel, go back to work more earnestly. Everything pretty much sometime in the third quarter of the year is really going to will have some semblance of normalcy. This will drive economic activity. Historically, direct written premiums are very tightly correlated with GDP growth. That's what you see, GDP growth in orange and direct written premium growth in blue. Obviously, the fluctuations in GDP are much more severe in 2020. And so while I think that there's some temporary dislocation here, these two different trajectories will resynchronize as we get out into 2022 or so. But the unemployment rate soared to nearly 15%. By April of last year, up from 3.5% in the span of just 60 days, which is unbelievable, though we finished the year at 6.7%. So we do see some recovery there, and we're expecting the unemployment rate to continue to fall through 2021 and, in fact, through 2022, where we could be back to around 4.5% or so. It's not clear that we'll, at any time in the near future, get back to 3.5%. But 4.5% is pretty close to full employment in the U.S. economy. On the downside of all of this, and of course, is how much money the government has spent is, of course, was necessary to help with the blow associated with COVID. But on the flip side of this, someone's got to pay for this somewhere, somehow. And so the national debt is blown up to $27 trillion and is approaching 130% of GDP, which blows away what we experienced even in World War II, the previous record. So this is something that's potentially inflationary down the line, but your children and grandchildren unmistakably are going to be paying for this. The commercial lines, where are we with respect to commercial lines? Very important, of course, in the surplus line space. Commercial lines is generally much more cyclical than is the overall P&C insurance industry. And that's because pricing cycles tend to be much more substantial. And what we see here is evidence of those pricing cycles, at least over the past a decade or so. What we are seeing are quarterly rate changes. These are data from the Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers. This is across all commercial lines. And so you see very strong numbers in the most recent data, which are as of the third quarter of 2020. And these are actually the strongest numbers we've seen in terms of renewals since the aftermath of 9/11. So that'll give you a sense. You have to actually go back all the way to roughly 2003 to see increases of this magnitude. If we drill down in the various lines that are impacted, this is a hard market that's been underway for a couple of years now. It really began mostly, I would say, after the record cat year of 2017, and it began in property lines, but it has been oscillating, and what we are seeing now is that leading the way is commercial umbrella, D&O, then followed by commercial, actually that should read commercial auto, and then commercial property beyond that, employment practices, business interruption. So you can see a mix, but it's being led by the casualty side here when we're talking about D&O and we're talking about commercial umbrella. I expect that to continue despite the pressure of the cat losses from last year. Now, in terms of litigation trends, this is one of the last things that I want to discuss. Litigation trends were deteriorating before COVID. So COVID has definitely added some additional pressure on this. And in fact, these are COVID numbers in terms of COVID-related lawsuits that have been filed against insurers. The most recent data from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, which has been tracking this, shows only 7 suits filed in early December, but that's down from nearly 80 back in May or so. So what could explain some of this? The fact that we've seen fewer? Well, what we can see here is that most of these cases have been filed in terms of business interruption. So you've seen these in California, you've seen these in New York, and everywhere in between. Many businesses very upset to find out that their business interruption policy did not cover them for closures, government-mandated closures associated with COVID. Because as you all know, those policies require direct physical loss or damage from a covered cause of loss. And so that simply was not present, certainly in the view of insurers. And in many cases, there were explicit virus exclusions in place. That didn't stop some enterprising attorneys for filing for business interruption and as well as extra expense and other sorts of things. There are most of the decisions thus far rendered. Insurers have been successful at getting summary judgments here, and the case is essentially dismissed in most cases. But there were some worrisome cases in early January that suggest that there are some jurisdictions that might be willing to entertain the most tortured interpretations of policy language that have ever come forth in the current issue with respect to business interruption and COVID. So these are occurring in a couple of states, and I think as many of you know, eventually plaintiffs' attorneys will find sympathetic jurisdictions that are willing to entertain arguments that have been thrown out by many, many other courts. So there is going to be litigation, I think, through the bulk of 2021 on this issue. I think insurers will prevail in the majority of them, but there will be some that potentially move in another direction. Overall, beyond COVID, we're looking at the average jury award across the country, which has been soaring in recent years, although moderated a bit in 2018. Unfortunately, these data lag behind considerably. 2018 data are, in fact, relatively new, but you can see the trend. Certainly the trend is up, and in terms of average award, which are often reduced by judges, of course, on appeal, but the median award is also up. Fortunately, the median is far less than the average, but you see some areas like product liability, med mal. These are ongoing problems across the country. And in fact, speaking about ongoing problems across the country is the most recent list from the American Tort Reform Association of the nation's judicial hellholes, which it lists California, the entire state, as a judicial hellhole, as some other states as well, such as Florida. So there's a lot of company, and then there are some more isolated issues, such as with particular legislatures, particular courts in a variety of states. So the tort issue has come back as an issue for all casualty insurers out there. And you see a lot of litigation related to, of course, what's happening on Wall Street, shareholder class actions, And if 2021, early 2021 is any guide, we're likely to see a resurgence in these cases. The number is a bit smaller in 2020, it's my understanding, in part because the courts wound up slowing down because of COVID. So once they catch up, we could see actually a substantial surge in 2021 to make up for that. So if you look at what's out there, suits related to obviously COVID, cannabis, opioids, data breach, cryptocurrency, Me Too, and now special purpose acquisition companies, SPACs, and which is sort of one of the new kids on the block in Wall Street. You'll see more of that going forward. So let me just summarize here and talk about the fact that, hey, this industry, strong, stable, sound, and secure. And there's a strong case for continued E&S growth out in 2021 and well beyond, in fact. The worst case scenarios with respect to COVID have been averted. That's great news. And I expect an acceleration in economic activity in the second half of 2021. And so that's going to help restore many of the lost P&C exposures, particularly in the most economically segments, such as workers' comp, which is about a $50 billion line in the United States, and as well as a few other areas like inland marine and other transportation sort of risks as well. Asset price volatility is going to be with us to stay, but low interest rates are going to be the most punishing feature of the investment scenario for insurers because it's going to last for many years, again, as we approach some of the lowest yields on the industry's portfolio that we've seen in the past 60 years. And so COVID-19 exposures are, in my view, manageable. But there is headline risk, and there will continue to be headline risk with respect to business interruption in particular. Those are going to be some potentially high-profile court cases, as well as some lingering workers' comp issues, though many of the institutions that were hit hardest with respect to workers' comp claims were healthcare institutions. We have now vaccinated the majority of healthcare workers in the United States. And so we would expect to see a rapid decline in, for instance, contracting of COVID in the context of healthcare institutions, hopefully a virtual elimination of deaths associated with that as well. And that will bode well for workers' comp insurers. So thank you very much for your time, your attention. I wish everyone the best of success in 2021 and beyond. Feel free to visit the USC Risk Center's website for presentations like this throughout the year at uscriskcenter.com. And so I'll hand it back to Ben and Terry for some questions. Thank you again.
Bob, great insight. Thank you. We do have some questions from the audience. Though we won't be able to get to all of them, we have pulled a couple of the questions to ask you now. For the rest of the questions out there, we are collecting those, and we'll put a FAQ up on our website and send you an email link where you can access those responses. So here's the first question. 2020 was overshadowed by COVID, but it was among the worst year for catastrophes, both worldwide, but more so in the U.S. What are the expectations on cat activity in 2021, and how prepared is the industry to weather another year like 2020, given all that we've already had to deal with?
There's no question that COVID really did overshadow what was extraordinary catastrophe loss activity in the United States and around the world. And of course, in California, the wildfires were on top of the headlines. But the reality of it is that that catastrophe activity just didn't get the headline exposure that it usually did because so much was going on, not just with respect to COVID, but also because it was an election year. Now, as we look ahead to 2021, what do we see in terms of cat activity? We could reasonably expect another pretty severe year in terms of hurricane activity in the Gulf Coast and along the southeast coast of the United States, and even up to parts of the eastern seaboard. But I think everyone is expecting more severe wildfire losses out in the West and in California in particular. And in fact, of the top 10 most costly wildfires in U.S. history now, in terms of insured losses, all of them have occurred in California in relatively recent years. So there seems to be no expectation that the long-term pattern of drought in the West is going to reverse anytime soon. We could certainly hope for as much of a snowpack as we can get in the West. But in terms of other activity that was unusual, in terms of man-made losses, in terms of riots and such things, and we are very concerned about domestic terrorism as an issue in 2021. We did have potentially at least one example of that when we were talking about the bombing in Nashville on Christmas Day. But there have already been a number of FBI alerts putting state capitals around the country on alert, and we would expect to see more of that, again, in terms of potential acts of domestic terrorism is a potential wild card for 2021.
Thank you, Bob. And hey, great presentation. I've got another question from one of our members. The UK Supreme Court recently dismissed insurer appeals over COVID-19 coverage after scrutinizing non-damage insurance policy clauses affecting some 370,000 policies. What do you foresee as the implications from this ruling for the United States insurance markets?
Good question. And the UK court ruling received a lot of press in the United States because courts in the United States had basically been reaching the opposite opinion. Now, I think it goes without saying that courts in the UK do not form any sort of a precedent in terms of courts here in the United States. It is not the case that judges are taking this into account in terms of how they make their decisions in the United States. So there's no way to derive any precedent from that decision in the UK. Also, fundamentally, the policies themselves that led to the different decision in the UK versus here in the US, where most cases are being dismissed, the policies are fundamentally different. The reality of it is that approximately 80% of business interruption policies and commercial property policies have an explicit microorganism exclusion, usually referencing virus and bacteria, specifically here in the US. You don't see that typically in Europe. So with that, and along with the much narrower policy language in the United States, I don't expect to see much of the way of carryover from the UK decision here in the US.
Bob, thank you again for joining us today.
Hey, thank you very much, Terry. It's my pleasure to be here.
Again, thanks to Dr. Hartwig for spending time with us today. We are close to wrapping up this year's meeting, and thank you again to everyone for tuning in and helping us deliver this not so normal way of holding an annual meeting. At this point, we're going to patch in a couple of our board members to share with you some brief committee reports. First, you'll hear from Tim Shea, who chairs our Education Committee, and then you're going to hear from Hank Haldeman, who chairs our Legislative Committee. Mr. Shea.
Thank you, Ben and Terry. My name is Timothy Shea, and I am the chair of the SLA Education and Compliance Committee. I'm going to share an overview of our 2020 program and provide some highlights of what we have in store for 2021. The SLA has been committed to providing continuing education courses to our California resident producers in a live setting in both Northern and Southern California. Courses are free to our members, their employees, and other interested parties such as legal and compliance professionals. The unanticipated events of 2020 put a temporary hold on our plans as we were forced to cancel courses for March and beyond. We refocused our efforts and continued a live webinar, continuing education program, which we launched in August. In 2020, we offered 9 live courses which provided California resident licensees with the possibility of earning 27 continuing education credits. We had over 2,200 attendees and awarded CE credits to over 1,800 licensees. In addition, we introduced 2 new on-demand courses and awarded CE credits to over 170 California licensees through our on-demand library. Certainly a very positive outcome in light of circumstances. The changes to our CE program in 2020 had a significant impact on our plans in 2021. We launched the 2021 season on January 21st, offering an ethics course that represents our single highest attendance of approximately 500 attendees. In March, we are presenting a course focused on COVID-19 as a new emerging risk and its impact on insurance brokers and the industry as a whole. 2021 plans include 14 live continuing education courses focused on topics relevant to our industry, current legislation, and market trends. While plans include returning to a live setting for continuing education courses, we will continue to live stream these courses to provide more options to our members and other parties. Our live stream courses will be converted for use as an on-demand with an effort to add 7 new courses to our library this year. We are also working on expanding the CE credit offering to our broker members outside of California in the second quarter. This will enable our non-resident California brokers to attend courses relevant to the business interest and receive credits in their resident state. Our education program doesn't stop there. We are working on building an on-demand program to provide general insurance education and compliance. In partnership with our members, we are designing a curriculum that can be used to train new brokers, employees, and other parties such as legal and compliance professionals. This program will offer CE credits or certificates as applicable. Our first course will be released during the first quarter and focuses on errors and omissions for the wholesale broker. Our education and compliance team is also in the process of launching a training and compliance series that will provide our members live webinar training that focus on compliance with California surplus lines filing requirements, use of our online portal, SLIP, and a discussion forum that focuses on a specific compliance topic or requirement. The SLA is committed to sharing information and educating our membership about surplus lines compliance and regulation. We look forward to continuing that mission in 2021. Thank you. That is my report. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Hank Haldeman.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks, Terry and Ben. I'm Hank Haldeman. I'm president of the Programs Division of Worldwide Facilities and also chair of the Surplus Line Association's Legislative Committee. I'll provide a brief rundown of key legislative issues that were on our radar screen in 2020, and I'll set the scenario for 2021. First, I'd like to recognize our Vice President for Public Affairs, Clifton Brown, and our CEO, Ben McKay, for the fabulous job they've done to assure that the well-meaning and beneficial actions of the Commissioner and the legislature in the face of unprecedented challenges presented by the pandemic and recent wildfires, that those actions to protect insurance consumers in California have not been undermined or have not undermined the basic underpinning of the non-admitted market, freedom and rate of form. We have closely followed 2 significant initiatives in the state legislature in 2020. Assembly Bill 3012 created a new clearinghouse for the California FAIR Plan. The FAIR Plan exists to provide fire coverage for applicants who cannot find it either in the admitted or non-admitted market. In the wake of the California wildfires, market constriction resulted in an inundation of the FAIR Plan and led it to seek insurers to take on some of those policies. The initial language of the bill would have precluded surplus line insurers from taking on these policies. However, Clifton reached out to the FAIR Plan and the Assembly Insurance Committee staff and found that the FAIR Plan actually would be happy to include surplus lines in the clearinghouse if a mechanism could be developed to ensure that admitted carriers got the first shot at taking on the business. Through collaboration, language was developed to provide for surplus line participation while safeguarding the rightful role of the admitted market. That language was included in the final bill, which has passed and now is law. Assembly Bill 1552 sought to require insurers to pay COVID-related claims that had been specifically excluded within business interruption policies. It was clear to many inside and outside the insurance industry just how devastating this would be to the financial stability of the insurance market. And multiple insurance and non-insurance industry groups explained their concerns to legislators. In the end, the author of the bill withdrew it from consideration before the Senate Insurance Committee could take it up. However, the proposal could be revised and reintroduced in 2021, and we're monitoring it closely. Touching briefly on other changes, both state and federal, in DC, Democratic control of the Senate brings a new chair to the Senate Banking Committee, Sherrod Brown of Ohio. While the House remains in Democratic hands, and thus Maxine Waters of Los Angeles remains chair of the House Financial Services Committee. What impact Democratic control of both houses will mean to the insurance industry isn't clear yet, but we'll continue to monitor such issues as the National Flood Insurance Plan, creation of the NRRA, the legal status of cannabis, and other issues as we see the policy changes within DC. Closer to home, in Sacramento, there have been some major changes in both Assembly and insurance committees. Cliston has been in touch with the new contacts, and that's of the staff there, and has commenced establishing relationships with them. The SLA has had great working relationship with both committees in recent years and has consistently made itself available to provide education and information about our market sector when it's needed. Cliston and our CEO, Ben McKay, have been called on numerous occasions to testify before those committees on issues such as the impact of wildfires on homeowners insurance. The chairs of both those committees have not changed, and both have demonstrated excellent leadership on insurance issues and have been consistently receptive to the SLA's efforts to provide relevant information about where surplus lines is needed and appropriate. Through 2021, we anticipate continuing our legislative mission to provide information and education about our market segment to both Congress and the state legislature and our regulators as needed. Our public affairs and policy team at the SLA continues to do a great job. Thank you to them, and thank you to you.
Thank you, Ben, for a really great meeting. I think it was well done, and for our first time doing this virtually, I really appreciate everybody that put this together, and thank you. And also for our participants, I'd like to also thank Bob and Tim and Hank. They all did a great job. So thank you all. And I want to also thank everybody that tuned in today. Thank you for being here. I hope to see all of you next year in person and doing what we do best, which is enjoying each other's company. Absolutely. This meeting is now adjourned. Dodgers.
What about the Lakers?
Not them too.
NorCal has to step up.
I know, we do have to step up.
The Surplus Line Association of California is prepared, and we'll carry out our mission to ensure a responsive and lawful surplus line insurance market is maintained in California. Thank you for attending our annual meeting.